She sat barefoot on the icy steps, soaked in blood, whispering only 4 words to the man who found her. "He's gone. I had to." Inside the cottage, her husband lay dead kitchen shears buried in his neck. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Because 6 months later, the woman who killed him vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a red ribbon and a trail of bodies tied to her past. Was she running from a killer or becoming one? The story begins in December of 2018, in a weather-beaten stone cottage on Marrow Lane number 14, to be precise. The neighbors called it the Granger Place, even though it hadn't belonged to a Granger in over a decade. That winter, it belonged to a woman named Isabel Grant, 34, and her husband Thomas, 41. From the outside, they looked like a couple quietly rebuilding. They had moved in 6 months prior, shortly after a reported nervous breakdown Isabel had suffered in their London flat. But, as any profiler will tell you, isolation is often the final ingredient before something erupts. I first learned about the case during a late-night call from DI Helen McCarthy. "It's not what it looks like," she'd said, almost in a whisper. And it doesn't look good. When the police arrived at the Granger cottage on the night of the 21st of December, the call had come from a passerby, an elderly dog walker. He'd seen Isabel sitting on the icy front steps barefoot, rocking. She was soaked in blood, her hands, her face, her nightdress. According to his statement, all she said was, "He's gone. I had to." Inside, Thomas Grant was found in the living room, his body slumped over the arm of a floral sofa, a pair of kitchen shears protruding from his neck. There were signs of a struggle. Blood splatter stretched across the bookshelves, floor lamp, and an old portrait above the fireplace. And on the coffee table, a shattered wine bottle and an open notebook, pages torn, some scorched by candle wax. The forensic analysis later revealed that Thomas had bled out within minutes. But it was the bruise-solder ones, faded yellow and green, that told a deeper story. On Isabel. On her ribcage, her wrists, the bridge of her back. Evidence that this wasn't the first time violence had visited the Granger cottage. Neighbors were shocked, though not entirely surprised. A few had noticed Isabel at odd hours swandering, sometimes hiding behind hedges. One woman, Mrs. Lorna Pitchford, said she once found Isabel crouched by the recycling bins, whispering to herself, hands trembling. She said she lost her wedding ring and needed to dig through, Lorna recalled. "But her hands were shaking so badly I offered to help." She refused, just looked at me with those tired eyes and ran off. But domestic violence rarely announces itself in full. It drips into everyday life, silent, subtle. A missed brunch, a bruise covered with a scarf, a voice that lowers whenever the partner enters the room. Thomas Grant was, by all accounts, a charming man in public. He worked remotely as a data analyst and had a dry wit that made him popular at the local pub. "Salt of the earth," one man described him. But when we spoke to Thomas's sister, she painted a darker picture. "He had a way of making you feel like you were the problem," she told us. He never yelled, but he controlled everything. What Izzy wore, who she spoke to, he made you feel small without raising his voice. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Emails from Isabel to her mother, unsent drafts, described her fear. "I keep checking the locks," one read. "I think he's going to kill me in my sleep." She had tried to leave once, packed her things, booked a train to Manchester. But he'd followed her, apologized, cried, promised he'd get help. And so she stayed. In her first police interview, Isabel barely spoke. She was calm, dazed. When asked why she didn't run after the first attack, she said simply, "Because he said he'd find me, and I believed him." The legal battle that followed gripped the country. The prosecution argued it was murder premeditated, intentional. They pointed to the fact that Isabel had retrieved the shears from the kitchen drawer, walked past the front door her escape route and returned to the room. She had a choice, they insisted. But the defense painted a different picture. A woman systematically broken, gaslit, terrified, living in a slow-burning hell until one night she snapped. What the court didn't know, what we found during our own investigation, was that there was a second notebook, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, a journal dated back to 2017. In it, Isabel had documented everything, every slap, every threat, every night. She stayed awake watching the door, waiting. One entry read, "If I disappear, it wasn't an accident. I want someone to find this. I want someone to believe me." And so we did. The jury deliberated for 6 days. But before the verdict was read, Isabel fainted in the courtroom. Her body collapsed, like someone finally letting go of years of survival mode. She was taken to hospital, under sedation. There's more to this story, more layers, more voices, more damage left behind. What really happened that night on Marrow Lane may never be fully known. Was it self-defense? A desperate act of freedom? Or something darker still? And the deeper question remains: how many more Isabels are out there, sitting silently in quiet cottages, waiting for someone to believe them before it's too late? When Isabel regained consciousness in the hospital 3 days later, the world had already formed its opinion. The tabloids had plastered her face across their front pages, some calling her the shear killer, others casting her as a tragic heroine. Social media wasn't any kinder. One tweet read, "If she really wanted to escape, she could have left. Women always have a choice." That one went viral. But as those of us close to the case know, escape isn't always visible from the outside. And sometimes, the only choice left is the unthinkable. Detective Inspector McCarthy visited Isabel the morning after she woke. She looked like a different person, McCarthy told me. Not wild, not broken, just empty. Like the storm had passed, and all it left behind was debris. There were things about that night that still didn't add up. Why had she burned some pages of her notebook? Why were there faint traces of sedatives in Thomas's system? And why had she left the door open after everything? Why hadn't she run? It took weeks before Isabel spoke freely. During a follow-up interview, she told McCarthy, "I didn't kill him to escape. I killed him because I finally believed he was going to kill me first." She had found a message scribbled in lipstick on the bathroom mirror the night before. "If I can't have you, no one will." That was the trigger. Toxicology confirmed that Thomas had taken diazepam, likely not prescribed, raising questions about his mental state. The defense would later argue that Thomas had drugged Isabel before, that he had rehearsed her death many times in his mind, even boasted about how no jury would convict him. "People like me," he told her once. You'll just look crazy." He wasn't entirely wrong. As the trial continued, another witness came forward, a former girlfriend of Thomas's, who had moved to New Zealand a decade earlier. Her statement, sent via video deposition, revealed eerie parallels. Control, isolation, fear. Even a story of her dog dying mysteriously after she'd threatened to leave him. The prosecution tried to keep the testimony out, citing irrelevance, but the judge allowed it. And that was the turning point. Then there were the crime scene photos never released to the public. I saw them during my own research. The shears were embedded with such force, the handle had snapped. There were defensive wounds on Thomas's hands. But oddly, his face was calm, almost peaceful. Forensic psychologist Dr. Leland Orr later told me, "Sometimes, in the final seconds, abusers realize they've lost control, and that terrifies them more than death. What fascinated me most was Isabel's behavior in the minutes after the murder. Instead of fleeing, she sat next to his body for hours. Didn't call the police, didn't wash her hands. She just waited. The defense called it psychological freeze, trauma-induced paralysis. But in her final testimony, Isabel explained it differently. I wanted someone to see me as I was. Not hysterical, not hiding, just still. For the first time, I didn't have to lie about what was happening inside that house. It was the most powerful moment of the trial. When the verdict was finally read not guilty, by reason of self-defense, there was silence in the courtroom. No cheers, no gasps, just a quiet release, like a collective exhale. Isabel walked out of the building wearing the same coat she'd worn when she moved into the Granger cottage 6 months earlier. But she didn't return there. She never will. The property has since been sold, stripped down, whitewashed. But locals say strange things still happen there. Lights flickering, windows slamming. One neighbor swears she heard someone sobbing through the walls. Of course, there's no evidence of that. There never is. But one thing remains. That hidden notebook, the one under the floorboard. Isabel left a message on its final page, written in ink barely legible. If someone finds this, tell my story. Not just for me. For every woman whose scream sounds too quiet. 6 months after the verdict, Isabel Grant vanished. She'd moved to a safe house provided by a domestic violence survivor program in northern Wales, changed her hair, and was quietly working as a part-time librarian under a different name, Eliza Morgan. Only a few people knew where she was. She kept no social media presence, carried a basic flip phone, and never returned to Alderley Hollow. But then, in early July 2019, I received a call from Detective Inspector McCarthy again. She's gone, she said breathless. No trace, no forwarding address. Her room was left like someone had just stepped out to get milk except her bag, wallet, and journal are all still there. And, she paused, someone left a red ribbon tied to her bedroom doorknob. The red ribbon. It didn't mean much to most people. But, in Isabel's court testimony, she had described it in chilling detail. It was something Thomas used to do when he was angry, when she had disobeyed him. He'd tie a thin red ribbon on their bedroom door just before punishing her. It was his silent warning, she'd said. I started fearing the color red more than his voice. The investigators found no sign of forced entry. No prints other than Isabel's, but one neighbor, an elderly man with poor vision, claimed he saw someone in a gray hoodie standing across the street that night. They didn't move, he said. Just stood there, watching. The case was reopened classified now as a missing persons investigation with a high risk of foul play. At first, there were theories that Isabel had staged her disappearance, that maybe she had a psychotic break. Some even suggested she joined an underground women's movement of domestic violence survivors rumors about a red circle that met in secret, taking justice into their own hands. But there was no proof. Nothing ever concrete. 3 weeks after she went missing, a second body turned up. This time, it was a woman named Faye Andrews, 29, from Manchester, a social worker who had testified on Isabel's behalf during the trial. Her body was discovered in her flat, suffocated with a pillow. No signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds. But left on her kitchen table was a red ribbon. Detective McCarthy was the first to draw the connection. But she wasn't the only one. Online forums lit up overnight. People began speculating about a killer targeting those connected to the Grant case, a revenge narrative. Or worse, someone who believed justice hadn't been fully served. And then the letters started coming. Typed. No return address. Sent to the police, a few journalists, and one to Isabel's mother. They were written in a disturbingly calm tone, all signed with a single letter, T. You thought it was over. You thought you understood me. But I was never just in the cottage. I'm in every hallway where silence wins. In every smile forced through bruised lips. Isabel didn't destroy me. She became me. That letter was sent exactly 1 year after Thomas's death. A handwriting analyst compared it to Thomas Grant's old work notebooks. While there were similarities, the letter was typed, and no fingerprints or DNA could be retrieved. The possibility that someone was copying his styler, that Isabel had developed dissociative identity disorder under years of trauma was floated, but ultimately dismissed due to lack of evidence. Still, McCarthy wasn't convinced Isabel vanished voluntarily. She believed something darker was unfolding. A pattern, a network, perhaps, or an individual ghost from the past who had watched the trial from afar, seething. And then, the third incident happened. In a small town near Bristol, a retired detective, who had once interrogated Isabel DCI Malcolm Rodeswas, found hanging in his garage, ruled a suicide at first. But when they examined the scene closely, they found a red ribbon tied to the inside latch of the garage door. And this time, it came with a recording. Just 3 words, whispered. You watched her. McCarthy brought me in, officially, at this point. Not as press, as a profiler. There were 2 working theories. Isabel was dead, and someone close to Thomasaur, inspired by his control, was recreating his psychological terror. Isabel was alive, and something inside her, was now rewriting her own narrative. But here's what kept me awake at night. The messages weren't just revenge. They were performative. They were calculated, like someone was building a story, one meant to be discovered. When I returned to Marrow Lane for my own investigation, the cottage stood empty. The landlord had never been able to rent it again. Locals avoided it like a bad omen. But inside, one thing had changed. In the back corner of the attic, scratched faintly into the wood, were the words, "He taught me how to disappear." No fingerprints, no footprints in the dust. Just that single message. I don't know if Isabel is alive. I don't know if someone is targeting the people who failed her, or if justice, in some twisted form, is unfolding in slow motion. But I do know this. Evil doesn't always die with a man like Thomas Grant. Sometimes it passes on. Sometimes it mutates. And sometimes it wears the face of a woman you thought was a victim. A woman whose voice you ignored. A woman who might now be hunting in the silence. 4 months later, Leeds, West Yorkshire. It started with a missing persons report. Catherine Halston, 38, schoolteacher, divorced, no known enemies. She failed to show up for work 3 days in a row, and a concerned colleague called it in. Police forced entry into her semi-detached home on the outskirts of the city. Her purse was still there, car keys on the kitchen counter. A steaming mug of tea had grown cold on the windowsill. But Catherine wasn't in the house. There was no sign of struggle. Except for one thing, a red ribbon tied to her classroom lanyard, hanging on the coat rack. The attending officer didn't make the connection at first, but when her name was entered into the system, a flag came up. Catherine Halston had once worked as a volunteer counselor in a women's shelter. The very same shelter where Isabel Grant had been briefly relocated before she vanished. The police immediately notified Detective Inspector Helen McCarthy. McCarthy had stepped back from active duty a month earlier, citing burnout. But she never really stopped working. She had a private wall of clippings, strings, photos of Isabel, Thomas, the victims. Red ribbons pinned in place of thumbtacks. Her own personal map of hell. When the Halston case crossed her desk, she knew. This wasn't coincidence. This was escalation. The media had started calling it the Ribbon Murders. 3 confirmed, 1 missing, no solid leads, and no suspect descriptions beyond the occasional witness seeing a woman in a gray hoodie, often described as calm, slow-walking, or deliberate. But here's the most chilling part. Each scene was accompanied by a handwritten envelope, usually left near the victim's belongings, addressed simply to you. The letter from the Leeds case read, "Some people think justice is a courtroom. Others think it's a grave. But justice is quiet. It walks behind you, unnoticed, until it stops being polite. You watched her run. You watched her beg. And you did nothing." It was signed again. T. Whether T stood for Thomas, trauma, truth, or terror, no one knew for sure. But a pattern was emerging. All the victims had one thing in common. They had either overlooked, undermined, or failed a woman in crisis. At least, that's what the letters suggested. Catherine Halston had testified in a disciplinary hearing 2 years earlier against a woman at the shelter alleging emotional instability and poor judgment. That woman had been removed from the program. Her name? Isabel Grant. Now, suddenly, everyone was asking the same question. Was Isabel punishing those who had failed her? Or had someone, even more dangerous, picked up her story and weaponized it? McCarthy's gut told her something darker was at play. She requested Catherine Halston's call records. On the morning of her disappearance, she had received 3 calls from an unknown number. When traced, the signal had bounced through 2 VPN servers before being lost entirely. But the voicemail left at 6:27 a.m. was still intact. "You had your chance to protect her," she cried to you. You told her to calm down. You gave her a pamphlet. "Now I give you silence." The voice was female, calm, unrecognizable. But it ended with an eerie human that, when analyzed by a sound technician, matched the same background noise found in a call Thomas once made to emergency services, a wind chime, one found only at the Granger cottage, which had long since been abandoned. McCarthy drove back to Marrow Lane. She parked across the street and watched it from her car. Late that evening, just as dusk set in, she saw movement inside, a flicker of light, a shadow crossing the upstairs window. She approached cautiously, hand on her torch, and opened the rusted gate. The door creaked open before she touched it. Inside, it was cold, dust-covered, but lived in. She could smell the faint scent of lavender and wood smoke. And then, in the center of the room, she found a folder. Inside were printouts, police reports, court transcripts, case notes. Every person connected to Isabel, annotated, circled, ranked. Catherine Halston's file had a red line through it. Beneath the folder lay another envelope, this time addressed to Helen. "You're the only one who listened. You're the only one who watched. I want you to see what silence looks like. I want you to choose. If justice isn't delivered, it will be taken. P.S. She's not dead. But she will be if you don't find her in time." She called in every favor she had, tracked CCTV from train stations near Leeds, cross-referenced timestamps. And then, a break. A woman in a grey hoodie boarded a coach from Leeds to Scarborough 2 nights before the letter arrived. She sat at the back, never looked up. She got off, near an abandoned seaside inn, long since shut down. When McCarthy arrived, she found the front door ajar. Inside, the air was wet with salt and decay. At the far end of the hall, a light flickered. And on the wall, scrawled in red ink, "This is the last warning." But there was no sign of Catherine Halston. Only a familiar scent in the air, lavender and blood. The abandoned inn on the Scarborough coast stood like a decaying monument to forgotten tragedy, its windows, clouded with mildew, doors long off their hinges, and the sea's roar constantly pounding in the distance. Detective Inspector Helen McCarthy stood at the threshold, flashlight in one hand, gun in the other, heart thudding in her chest. The red ink message on the wall, "This is the last warning," hadn't fully dried. It smeared slightly when she touched it, sticky like diluted blood. It wasn't a threat. It was a countdown. She moved through the narrow hall, guided by the beam of her torch. Her foot brushed something metallica chain, a set of small silver bells, strung along a velvet ribbon. Wind chimes. The same sound heard on the voicemail. At the end of the corridor was a trap door, slightly open, leading to the old basement. McCarthy descended carefully, her breath fogging in the cold underground air. The light revealed a small, dim room. Dust hung thick like smoke. And in the center, tied to a rusted iron chair, was a woman, pale, gaunt, duct tape over her mouth, eyes wild with panic. It was Catherine Holston, alive, barely. McCarthy rushed to her, cutting the zip ties binding her wrists and ankles. Catherine collapsed into her arms, sobbing. "She's still here," she gasped. She wanted me to feel it. What it was like. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. McCarthy raised her weapon. "Stay down here," she whispered to Catherine, then turned off her flashlight and crept back up the stairs. The inn was no longer silent. She could hear it now's low footsteps. Careful, unrushed, the same deliberate pace described by all previous witnesses. In the hallway stood a woman, slim, grey hoodie, head bowed. When McCarthy raised her torch, the woman slowly lifted her face. It was Isabel Grant, but something was different. Her Eisonsveken now shimmered with eerie calm. Her face was serene, expression unreadable. McCarthy didn't lower her weapon. "Isabel," she said, voice steady. "It's over. Catherine is alive. Let's talk." Isabel blinked, tilted her head. "I never wanted to be found," she said quietly. "But they kept talking. They kept rewriting what happened to me. Then let the courts. They had their chance." Isabel stepped forward. "I begged for help. Do you remember how many people told me to pray harder or be more patient? Do you know how many bruises were misunderstandings?" McCarthy kept her voice calm. "You're not alone. But this isn't justice. This is revenge." "No," Isabel whispered. "This is prevention." She reached into her hoodie. McCarthy's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't move." But Isabel didn't draw a weapon. She pulled out a folded page, slowly handed it over. McCarthy opened it. It was the first entry from Isabel's original journal. "I wonder how long I'll last before someone believes me. I've started writing things down now, so when I die, someone will know the truth." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes, but not from sorrow, from peace. "Now, they know," she said. She didn't run. She didn't resist when backup arrived. She was led away in silence, the same way she'd sat on the blood-soaked porch of the Granger cottage that December night. 6 months later, the case was closed. Isabel was ruled mentally unfit to stand trial and transferred to a secure psychiatric hospital in Yorkshire. She was no longer considered a threat to the public, but the media didn't buy it. Documentaries, podcasts, and opinion pieces poured in, some calling her a monster, others a martyr. The files on the Ribbon murders remained locked under police review. All the victims survived except one, DCI Malcolm Rhodes. His death remained classified as a suicide, but some believed Isabel had help. Others claimed she wasn't alone in her mission, that the Red Circle was real. To this day, no official network has been discovered, no confirmed accomplices. But every few months, A letter still arrives at a random office, hospital, or courthouse. Typed, clean, and always signed T. And each one ends the same way. Justice delayed is still justice. But silence is complicity. Final reflection. This story is not about one woman or one crime. It's about the invisible screams behind closed doors, the bruises labeled as clumsy, the voices ignored until they become violent. It's a mirror held up to our systems, our apathy, and our failure to listen. Because sometimes the villain isn't the one holding the weapon. It's the silence we choose. The silence that kills. End.